South Africa's past of colonization, slavery, and apartheid still echoes in the inequality of today, making true transformation a pressing need. But imagine a South Africa where we find language to articulate and address these wounds so we can heal, and where a diverse group of people and communities come together to learn from each other, collaborate, and build trust to realize an alternate future where access to dignity translates into equity and justice, not as an ideal, but a lived reality for all. For decades, we have witnessed the devastation of our planet, not only through historic injustices and compromise of our social fabric, but in the concurrent destruction of our natural ecosystems too, which have affected the poorest communities the most. As climate change intensifies, the global push for a just energy transition has placed renewable energy at the forefront, not just as an environmental solution, but as a pathway to enable these communities to survive and thrive. South Africa's response to this call is the REAP, a bold and visionary program that links energy production with socio-economic development. What makes REAP unique is its socio-economic development framework and community ownership model. Communities are not only recipients of development projects, they are shareholders in the power plants. But greater collaboration is key to achieving the full potential of renewable energy in South Africa, beyond meeting the IPP office requirements.
The opportunity with REAP is to go beyond compliance and to be intentionally transformative.
The construction phase of an IPP project within REAP stimulates local economies through its demand for various types of goods and services, work and skills. This phase results in substantial temporary job creation and opportunities for regional businesses. When the plant plugs into Eskom and moves into the operations phase, it generates revenue in return for the power produced. A percentage of this income is allocated to socio-economic and enterprise development, or SED and ED spend on community projects. When the plant starts turning an annual profit and when the project company declares and distributes dividends, the community trust also receives its share. From the share, the community trust needs to service the debt associated with its shareholder loan, the loan that facilitated its purchase of shareholding in the plant. The balance of these dividends can then be used to build local capacity, create opportunities, and invest in community development projects. Yet making this model work in practice is complex. Though we cannot rewrite the historic injustices of humanity's past, the deep wounds borne by our ancestors and consequences that subsequent generations bear to this day, we do have an opportunity to play a part in writing a new story for generations to come. So today, let's imagine a South Africa where a strengthened and networked ecosystem in the renewable energy sector leads the charge and harnesses the energy of tomorrow to build a just, dignified, and equitable future for all.
Good morning and a warm welcome to all of you to the second Trust Matters webinar, which is part of a portfolio of initiatives for the trust ecosystem to connect, learn, and collaborate for impact. This is delivered under Inspire's Trust Matters project, which focuses on strengthening the role of community trusts in South Africa's renewable energy landscape. My name is Maschaba Mabilu, and I'll be your host for this webinar that's brought to you by Inspire in collaboration with Infra Impact Investment Managers. Inspire is the initiative for social performance in renewable energy, is a South African NPO working to ensure that renewable energy projects are not only green, but also just, inclusive, and community empowering. Founded in 2022, Inspire supports social performance practitioners, IPPs, and community investment vehicles to shift from fragmented, compliance-driven practices to strategic models of benefit sharing. This Trust Matters project has been supported by the IDC to capacitate community trusts in REAP by mobilizing community leadership to drive developmental impact. This webinar, as I've said before, is delivered in partnership with Infra Impact, which is a specialist infrastructure fund manager mobilizing capital for impact, focusing on waste, water, renewable energy, and digital infrastructure. We'll specifically this morning be focusing on establishing the link between the financing of community trusts and their effectiveness as a community benefit vehicle. We'll also showcase how refinancing can unlock the financial capacity of renewable energy community trusts and thereby redirect capital back to these communities that the trusts are meant to serve. We have a very stellar lineup of speakers this morning who will contextualize and unpack the challenges that limit trusts' capacity to act as true vehicles for community empowerment, as well as explore these solutions to addressing these. So we have on our panel Thuli Dlamini. She's an Inspire board member and founder of Mzansi Impact Solutions. She was previously the SED manager at the IPP office and part of the team that monitored the implementation of SED and ED obligations of IPPs under REAP. Yumna Furfuri leads towards Uhuru, and she's also an economic development specialist and a senior strategic partner to Inspire. And from Infra Impact, we have co-founder and CEO Mark van Wyk, as well as Bulelwa Ntingwa and Mzo Chaka, who are both investment principals working on the local community debt fund. All speaker bios are available in the chat. And then just some housekeeping before we dive in. For specific questions to panelists, we're going to use the Q&A, the Q&A section. And then we're happy for you to continue and have as much robust discussions as you can have in the chat. Now, going back to community trusts. So community trusts are now currently the predominant vehicle for communities shareholding in REAP, holding an average of 8% equity in rounds 1 to 4. These trusts have, however, been plagued by various challenges that limit their capacity to act as true vehicles for community empowerment. Key to these is, of course, the long delay between the establishment of the community trust and the flow of dividend income, as well as the quantum of dividends against the high developmental expectations of communities. To kick us off, we're going to start off with a discussion with Thuli on contextualizing the inclusion of community ownership in the REAP ecosystem, and specifically in the economic development structure of not just REAP, but also the additional IPP programs that are being undertaken by the IPPO. Thuli?
Right. Thank you very much, Aisha, and thank you, Maschaba, for the introduction. I'm going to be talking about situating or contextualizing community ownership in REAP. Why was it necessary and why it matters? I know that the video actually did talk about the necessity of economic development, the framework of economic development in REAP in its entirety, but I'll just touch on why community ownership. If we move to the second slide, what I intend to do is maybe tell the story of community ownership in REAP through the lens of a story, really. Imagine a child that has been locked out of their home with their family. The family has owned the home and occupied it for generations. Yet one day, another family comes and takes occupation of the home and chases out the original family that was the homeowners, puts them out on the streets, and they are left destitute in the cold, only allowed to sweep the yard, not to even come in and partake in the house and in the possessions that were in the house. This metaphor really represents the economic exclusion experienced by Black South Africans under apartheid. They were denied ownership and participation in their own country's economy. In 1994, if we move to the next slide, Aisha, democracy came. There was the advent of democracy. And with it came the challenge of how to restore the economy and allow the economy to be accessible by all the owners of the country. So political freedom was achieved, but economic freedom remained elusive for the majority. Land, capital, and opportunity remained concentrated in the hands of a few. And the economy was still structurally closed off to Black South Africans. Next slide, please, Aisha. The government then, at the dawn of democracy, was faced with a daunting challenge of how to restructure the economy which had initially been built on exclusion without collapsing it entirely. It was a daunting challenge. And they had to do this in a fair way and in a transparent way. It required careful policy design that balanced transformation with economic stability. How do you do that? How do you do that as a new Black government, having faced all the challenges of apartheid and trying to correct all the moral challenges that it presented? It was a very difficult challenge. Let's move on to the next slide, Aisha. So what they had to do was essentially to rewire the economy without collapsing it, assuring rightful participation, restoring rightful participation to Black people. And that's why the government came up with the broad-based Black economic empowerment. The objectives of the Act include, amongst other, empowering rural communities to access impactful economic opportunities. In fact, if you look at Section 2F of the Act, its key objective there states that it is to empower rural and local communities by enabling access to economic activities, land, infrastructure, ownership, and skills. So the idea was to change racial composition of ownership structures, increase community ownership of enterprises, and promote broad-based participation in the economy. And the thinking was that with the broad-based focus, it could actually amplify and catalyze economic restoration among Black people. Let's move on to the next slide, please, Aisha. RIP then presented a very unique opportunity to the government to roll out its intentions through BEE. And the Department of Energy at the time took this opportunity with both hands. As we all know, all businesses that are operating in the country are supposed to adhere to triple BE and its requirements. When the department designed this project, they made sure that triple BE is central, and the economic development framework that was then established was mimicking and still does mimic the triple BE Act, and in particular, the generic scorecard. So through REAP, there was the opportunity to create a new economic sector in the country. And the goal was not just electricity generation, but restoring economic fairness, economic justice. It was a chance to implement the Triple BE Act in a new industry. Please move to the next slide, Aisha. And what it deliberately did was to situate communities at the center. And the community ownership requirement was one of the key pillars of the economic development framework of REAP. So communities, the idea there was that communities were not just to watch the turbines turn, but they were to co-own them. REAP made community ownership a requirement, a symbol of shared benefit and inclusion. At the start of the program, the requirement was a minimum of 2.5% shareholding to be given to communities that host the renewable energy plants. And at the time, the communities were required to be within a 50-kilometer radius of the projects. Most of the IPPs, to comply with this requirement, then put in place community trusts. We can move on to the next slide, Aisha. Now, why does it matter? Because what good is clean energy if it leaves communities disempowered? What good is it if the communities are still not sharing or participating in the economic transformation that this new sector was expected to bring about? So why we have it, or why we had it initially in REAP, was to ensure economic inclusion and that benefits flow to historically marginalized communities. It was also to create long-term dividend streams for community development, thereby creating generational wealth for communities. But also it was also to make sure that communities accept these new companies in their host environment. It was to build local support for renewable energy projects. And the intention was deliberately to make sure that REAP is not just about power, but also about empowerment. Next slide, please. So going back to the story, the house wasn't complete just by opening the door and letting the original family back in, but it was to make sure that all the inhabitants can sit together equally around the table. So community ownership in REAP is part of the long journey back home to justice, dignity, and shared prosperity. It represents a concrete step towards economic transformation, where renewable energy becomes a vehicle, not just for environmental sustainability, but for social justice. Last slide, Aisha, please. So community ownership is a cornerstone of South Africa's just energy transition. It allows historically marginalized communities to participate in the renewable energy economy rather than being passive bystanders. It serves a dual function or a dual role: climate goals and social equity objectives, all at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tuli, for that reminder that while there may be challenges on the ground, the objectives for incorporating or including community ownership as part of the REAP were informed by not just our history and context, but a recognition of the need for the economic growth agenda of the country and related infrastructure programs to include measures for redress much more proactively. I'd now like to invite Yumna Furfuri to share her perspective and insights on some of the key challenges that community trusts have been facing, particularly in terms of operationalizing and delivering on that broad-based community impact.
Thank you, Master Chaba, and good morning, everyone. And let's see where that was such a beautiful metaphor. Thank you so much for bringing that creativity into the storytelling. I think it's so important to understand that full picture that community ownership fits into. And so if we're looking at community ownership from a REEF perspective, I think what you've shown us is that there's a real potential within community ownership in REEP. But if it is not strategically leveraged, it's not going to promote that meaningful participation of communities in the transition to renewable energy. And so we really have our work cut out for us. And it seems like, I love your metaphor that only the door has been opened, but the house hasn't been fixed. The table doesn't have food on it. So there's a lot of work that we've got to do as an industry in order to really make the spirit of community ownership translate into practice. And if we look at REAP, so community trusts in South Africa have been established to promote inclusive development in renewable energy through the REAP program, through community ownership. And there's been a minimum mandated percentage that communities have to have shareholding in the project company. And that goes from anything from 2.5% up to 30%. But the average currently sits at about 8%. However, when the financial structuring happens for these community trusts as part of the business development stage of any project company, communities are engaged with, yes, I think that box needs to be ticked as part of the stakeholder engagement phase of setup of the project company. But that stakeholder engagement phase doesn't necessarily talk about the details. And I think the devil is in the details. And then I think I'll get to those details now, I think, but even besides the shareholding, even besides the details, in the shareholding is not community ownership. Shareholding is something on paper. Community ownership is, the questions I think for me are, do the communities feel, the communities around the power plant, do they feel that they own part of the project company, or is it still a very removed concept? They can see the turbines, they can see the panels, but do they feel ownership in it? I think ownership means that you also get to play a role in decision making, that you feel capacitated to be able to engage constructively, that there are platforms to be able to engage. And I think for me, there's a big question, and at Inspire as well, there's a big question as to whether real community ownership is in place or whether it is actually only just shareholding. And then I promised that we'd also look at the details. So during the business development stage, there are also questions made or questions that need to be answered and decisions that need to be made around how do the loans that get taken out for community ownership to be realized, So the loans for the communities to own 2.5%, 8%, 10%, 15%. How is that going to be repaid? And that's the issue of our webinar today, is how do those get repaid? Firstly, I don't think the communities have engaged in the conversation around, is it free carry, or do they have to take out a stake shareholder loan? And in 99% of the cases, it is through a loan. There's very few free carry examples within REAP. And then when there is a loan, how does that loan get repaid? So is there a 95% cash sweep, for example, which means that 95% of the dividends that the community trust gets has to be going to the shareholder loan? All of those details are not part of the questions and part of the decision-making processes that happen in those stakeholder engagements with the community upfront. So what then happens is that there's often only a very small trickle dividend, because even in the project company, there are very small profits made in early years. So those profits, the small profits in the early years compared to in the later years, probably for the first 12 years, very small profits also translate into very small dividends. And then on top of that, you then have, of those small dividends, a large percentage goes towards paying the shareholder loan. So what the community trust then sits with to be able to use for community projects is a very small amount. And that's what I think what we call the trickle dividend in the first couple of years, compounded by all of the expenses that need to be covered by the trust in those first years. So it's finding the right trustees, doing the election process to find the right trustees, and then capacitating the trustees around their fiduciary roles, community trust. The vehicle might be a new concept for community trustees, so capacitation around that, induction processes, putting in place systems and policies, processes, standard operating processes for the trust to function, having engagement with the community around what their needs are. That all costs a lot of money, coming out of a very small and limited purse in those first few years. And this is where you have the community expectations around what was spoken to them about in the community engagement phase of, we're going to own part of the power plant and we're going to share in the benefits of the power plant. And communities have this expectation around, oh yes, we want to have that ECD center, we want our school improved, we want that and the other. And that costs a lot more money than the money that's on the table. And so there's a lot of frustration and disillusionment that happens at that stage. And often those who need to manage that chasm and manage that frustration are often either the social performance practitioners at the IPP as well as the trustees in the trust. And most often, because a lot of the independent trustees are not on site, it's the community trustees that have to hold that frustration. And they sit in a very difficult position because they're community members themselves. They know what the needs are, but they also know the limited availability of funds at the trust. So I think that's what we're sitting with at this point in time. From an Inspire perspective, we've been really fortunate that the IDC, which has provided equity finance for a number of the community trusts, have also supported our Trust Matters program, which Master Chaba spoke about at the beginning. And that's allowed us to do a lot of exploration, a lot of talking and discussions and workshops with community trustees, with trusts. And we've actually conceptualized a trust maturity framework. Aisha, if you just want to beam up that picture of what the trust maturity framework is quickly. I'm not going to talk very long about that. But it's been really helpful getting these insights and the wisdom from the community trustees, from the community trusts, to be able to understand what all of the issues are. And you can see on the screen what that has helped us to construct then is this trust maturity framework, which is made up of, on the top, you can see the trust support ecosystem, that it's not only the community trustees and the independent trustees that hold the trust, but there's a whole host of role players that should be supporting the trust, together with founders, financiers, IPP office. Not all of those role players are playing that role, and we need to actually see how everyone plays that role to be able to really hold the trust. And what we've also found is that there are pillars that hold up the trust as well. The pillars of governance, pillars of vision and strategy, having a real idea of the long term and the trust's role in meeting that vision of the long term, because the trust also doesn't have to do everything. There are other role players with money that play a role, and it's about connecting with all of those. And then also impactful delivery. How do you roll out effective projects, and how do you localize those projects, not only in terms of the beneficiaries, but also those implementing the projects? How are those becoming more local? And then, of course, underpinning all of that is capacity building. So that's a trust maturity framework that we've worked at and worked on. And part of what we're doing now is looking at how we can play all of those roles as Inspire of building the support in governance, in vision and strategy, and impactful delivery. And this webinar is one of those opportunities of providing those resources to community trusts to be able to strengthen what they have. So that's my story, Masachaba.
Thank you so much, Yumna. I think we're running a bit behind time, so I've just got one question for you. So, reflecting on the initial objectives that Uleziwe mentioned, and as well as the experience to date that you've just stated, as well as thinking about the decline in tariffs and even the equity position of communities in these later REAP rounds, can communities trust still support equitable benefit sharing and promote long-term community development in REAP or whatever permutation of its future looks like?
I think there's a real potential, a realizable potential, because there always has been a potential, but there's a real realizable potential for that to happen. And I think it's also about shifting focus. A lot of the focus of trust has been around governance. How do we get our house in order? How do we get the processes in place? And even if a lot of that is done, it's not going to shift the needle on community benefit. And so the discussions that we're having with Trust now in various of our workshops, engagements, is around how do we really shift that needle, and how do we provide some of the governance support that they don't have to go out and utilize time and effort and money to do? How can we provide potential standardized operating procedures and policies that trusts only need to tweak here and there, so that they can start focusing on vision and strategy and community engagement, and really bringing communities in to share the responsibility of conceptualization and implementation of programs. So I think I am an eternal optimist, but I think the potential is there for that to be done.
Thank you, Yumna. And Ledziwe, your perspective on what the future of community trust should look like based on the current context?
I think, sorry, let me turn on my camera. Yumna has really touched on it. One of the ways that we can also improve really is to look at how other countries have done it. For example, different countries have succeeded in localizing community trust, so that meaningful ownership is also translated to communities, and they really feel that they own those plants that are located in their communities. For instance, in Scotland, trusts such as the Nilston Community Wind Farm also co-own renewable energy assets and channel income into community-led initiatives. We have examples coming out of Denmark and Germany and France and Belgium with the EcoPower fund, which enables citizens to own equity in energy projects. We have other examples in Canada and the US, where we have indigenous communities also owning clean energy facilities. These examples really illustrate that beyond traditional community trusts, other innovative, locally relevant structures such as stokvels, cooperatives, joint ventures, community companies can also be considered to successfully support equitable benefit sharing and sustainable development. As Yumna has said, with proper support and accountability, these models demonstrate that communities can retain ownership, voice, and value in the energy transition.
Thank you, Netsue. I think your comments lead us very well into the next conversation with Mark, where we're going to focus on the financing of community equity and the related risks and challenges. Good morning, Mark.
Good morning.
Sure. So if we're looking at community equity and how it's been financed in REAP and other infrastructure investments, what would you say are some of the risks and challenges linked to these current financing structures and leading to these challenges that we are now talking about?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Mr. Chaba, and thank you to my fellow panelists in terms of this wonderful conversation that we're having together. I think maybe just to give you some context in terms of how we've been involved in this program since the inception of the REAP program, and even prior to that, in looking at rural economic development. So as a fund manager, we are custodians of capital of institutional pension funds mainly. And in 2008, we started working on a program of funds that comes behind the National Development Plan. And the National Development Plan embedded into it was, a couple of giants that was identified by the commissioners that prevents our country from moving forward. And the ultimate objective was to eradicate poverty and reduce inequality as the central piece of the National Development Plan. And some of these giants that have been identified that prevent us from achieving those objectives were, rural economic development and spatial patterns marginalizing the poor. And in terms of our crumbling infrastructure, our carbon-intensive energy generation program we had in the country. And so, given some of those challenges, government, as Tuli mentioned earlier, designed a program that can actually address some of those challenges, but also unlock some of the opportunities that this massive procurement program, which is the REAP program, probably government's largest procurement program ever, can unlock, not just to address some of the issues, but also set us up for the future. And so, at the advent of REAP, as a fund manager coming behind National Development Plan, we were looking to find businesses that operated in the rural areas, that was economically sustainable, that can protect the capital for our investors, but also uplift rural communities. And the REAP program ticked all those boxes for us. And so we were one of the first managers to invest into the construction of projects, more than 2.8 gigawatts of projects on the debt side, 17 projects in total across wind and solar technologies. And it was a very interesting period. We then subsequently observed some changes in the market. I think the first challenge for local communities came when at the successor rounds, like round 4 or 5, there was some noises about excluding community trusts from ownership in this program going forward, given the fact that very little tangible economic benefit was seen to be coming from the community ownership. And that is when we started working with some of the founders at Inspire and the IDC actually to write to the department to request that the community ownership continues to be a part of this program, and we were successful in that regard. That was the first challenge that we saw, that this opportunity might be taken away from rural communities. The second challenge that we've observed in the market was what we call an inefficiency of the capital markets. And here we observed the fact that the program was designed in such a way that the communities, unfortunately, I think Yumna alluded to this, that the communities weren't given these shares for free. They had to borrow money to buy it. And in most cases, they borrowed it at very expensive interest rates with very detrimental repayment profiles as well, which then ultimately resulted in the communities only being able to access meaningful cash flows out of these projects 15 to potentially 18 years from now. And we saw that as a challenge. And I think compounding that challenge was the fact that what we've observed was that outside the community trust, there were other shareholders as well in the projects. And the other shareholders managed to reduce their cost of financing, improve their repayment terms, so they can facilitate earlier cash flows for themselves. And these other parties, let it be the financial investors or the PE investors, all benefited from this. And it's almost like having two neighbors, two houses in the same street, where the one family, and I'm coming to Thuli's example, the one family is paying prime plus 5% for their loan, for their mortgage, and the other family in the same road, same house, is paying prime. And therefore, the one family can potentially have, nice food on a Friday, and the other family don't have food because they've taking all their money to service very expensive debt. And we saw that to be unjust. And therefore, we then stepped out to try and solve the problem. We then embarked on a very extensive program. In 2020, we reached out to investment bankers in the United Kingdom called Lion's Head to help us find a solution to reduce the cost of financing for local community trusts, and therefore enable them to unlock some of the endowment value for the benefits of the communities earlier and more. In partnership with Lion's Head, we then were introduced to the German development bank called KfW. And after an extensive period of close to 3 or 4 years, we managed in 2023 to sign an agreement with the German development bank, where the German development bank facilitated a first loss facility to enable us to get a fund going, whereby which we're supposed to be mobilizing from local pension funds. That's also got the objective to come behind the National Development Plan and address some of the social issues, to mobilize about 2 billion rand of capital at reduced financing costs, better repayment terms, and assist communities with local governance issues in terms of addressing their objectives. And so those are examples, Masechaba, in terms of what we saw as being the problem set, and then having gone to market with our relationship capital in the capital markets to find a solution. And that is the purpose why we are here today and why we've set up this fund to address those issues.
Thanks so much, Mark. I mean, just the one thing that's quite curious is knowing the context, and after such multiple rounds of REAP, why have our DFIs not stepped in to resolve this financing structure and challenge that the very communities that they're funding are actually faced with?
Well, I can't really speak for all of the DFIs. I must actually commend the DFIs firstly, Masechaba, in terms of having taken the leap of faith to actually facilitate the unlocking of these opportunities for these communities. I think the DFI mandates are in such a way also that the DFIs also get funded from the debt capital markets, both the IDC, the DBSA, and the banks. And very few of our commercial banks have actually funded local communities with just the DFIs. And because of the internal funding structures, we assume is prohibitive potentially in terms of them reducing the financing costs because of the internal regulation that they have within their businesses. Us being a fund and us having secured, it's called additional security for our investors, we are able to actually address the challenge because we don't have the similar constraints as a normal DFI could potentially have.
Thanks so much, Mark. Are you happy for me to bring in Bulelwa and Nzo then to talk us through the local community trust debt fund?
Yes.
Thank you, Masechaba. If you can put up the presentation we prepared. Okay, Good day, everyone. Just to talk about Infra Impact and the product that is bringing us together today. I would like to thank you, everyone who's attended this, and Inspire, who helped us to put this together and have this conversation, that my fellow panelists are getting into the issues that we're facing. Next slide. Infra Impact is a specialist impact investment manager that was founded in 2018. It's 100% Black owned. Currently, on the equity side, we're managing a mid-market infrastructure fund that is around 2 billion, supported by 13 institutional investors and insurance companies with 1 DFI. We just recently launched the Local Community Trust Debt Fund, which is a blended finance vehicle. What it's designed to do is to refinance the community investment vehicles that have taken loans from DFIs and also that are vendor financed by some of the IPPs. And some of them, they're experiencing quite a high cost of capital that is delaying some of the intentions of involving communities in the RIP structure, because the main objective of having them, it was delivering social projects. And when you look at most trustees of these investment vehicles, they're trying to address some of the key issues that communities are facing in South Africa, being health issues, being education, being empowering like entrepreneurs in communities so that they can start participating in the economic growth of this country. So what this fund is trying to do is trying to enable the communities to achieve those intended benefits quite sooner than what we're experiencing currently. We do provide some favorable terms relative to what we're seeing in the market. And the objectives really of this fund is to make sure that there's inclusivity, there's accountability, and there's sustainability, and there's shared value creation. Next slide. If we had to give a context of what drove us to think of this product, a few years ago, the Times magazine said South Africa is the world's most unequal country. That's the reality we're living in. And it was there in 1994 when we got democracy, and it's still something that we are experiencing. If you look at the table below that picture by Time magazine, it's showing the Gini coefficient of South Africa. That talks to the numbers, that explains this inequality. If you look at like a difference between urban and the rural side, it's experiencing more inequality relative to the urban side. And this poses the challenge that was being addressed by the IPP office and the Department of Energy when they put together this program, saying that we need BEE to be involved, we need communities to be involved. So if you look at how the energy mix in South Africa, we are a coal country predominantly, and now we're moving because of climate change to renewables. And the big question is that when we do that, do we take communities with that journey in terms of economic participation, in terms of reducing that poverty and making sure that that inequality is going in the right direction? The next slide. What was interesting when this program was set up, the department was wise in realizing that there's a balancing act that needs to be taken into account in putting this program. At the time, load shedding was starting, And also they could foresee that it's going to be the challenge of the future. So security of supply was quite important. But that security of supply, it needed to come with affordable solution. Affordable solution is coming through renewables. If you look now at renewables in terms of the cost relative to other technologies, it is reasonable. And when you start looking at batteries coming into the market, it looks like we will get to base load using renewables in the future. And then the other important thing was that because of our coal-based energy generation, we were the biggest emitters as well in Africa. So reducing carbon emissions was also one of that. And then in terms of technologies also, it was quite important that the technologies that are coming through renewable energies, they have lower water utilization. And we know that water is one of the challenges that South Africa is facing and that we need to grapple with and find solutions. But in the center of all this balancing act, there was rural economic development. That was the key thing. There was localization and there was job creation. Hence, it was important to have community participation. So on the right is just a snapshot of what has been achieved so far. We've got 95 IPPs that are operational. And of that, it's different rounds. Shareholding by local communities is sitting at 9%. Having said that, that 9% shareholding, it was high in the initial rounds, but in the later rounds now, we're finding that incorporating communities in most projects, it will be like 2.5%. We would like that number to increase, but there are challenges that makes that number to be reducing instead of increasing, and instead of getting communities to levels of shareholding that they can have a voice in the board of these IPPs. So that's the challenge that institutions like Infra Impact and other fund managers, we need to find solutions to try to address that. The next slide. I think on this slide, let me give my colleague Zo to talk about the legal structure of the fund. I'll come back in later slides. Zo, over to you.
Thanks, Bulelwa, and good morning, everyone. So as you can see on the slide, so our fund is set up as a trust. So we've registered a trust in SA, and we have received, I think Mark mentioned it earlier, we received an initial 20 million euros from KfW in the form of as a first loss in the fund. We are currently in the process of raising the additional 80 million euros to get to the 2 billion rand fund that we are targeting. The funders that will come in with the 80 million euros will subscribe to loan notes that will be issued by the trust. The trust will then conclude the loan agreements with the various community investment vehicles, and we use that term because some of these trusts, they contract as PTY LTDs that are owned by the community trusts, and some will contract as community trusts. So those trusts will then have a loan agreement with our trust, and Infra Impact's role there, we have been appointed by the trust / the fund as the fund managers. So we then manage that process and manage the process post. So from generating those leads, doing the transaction and managing it post investment, that will all be the role that as Infra Impact we play. You can go to the next slide. Ms.
Okay.
B, I think that's yours.
Yes, in terms of when we started this, we used a company called Synergy Global Consulting to try to see how big is the opportunity for this kind of product of refinancing trust. They did the market study for us. what they covered on this study, so to put in context the numbers that are on the screen, it was an analysis of community participation of up to round 4. And now we know that where the RIP is, they've just announced the preferred bidders on round 7. So these numbers are understated relative to the market size of this. But even though they understated, it gives a context of the opportunity. We identified that there's a 17 billion market for refinancing, with that holding between 8 and 9% ownership owned by community trust. So we think this is quite significant, and it's a market gap that doesn't have a lot of players that are playing into it, and we're hoping that we can close that gap. But it will take different funds. It will take a lot of our peers to start looking at this and trying to work with us and solve this gap that is in the market. The next slide. So what is really our value proposition? In terms of that study, up to round 4, the income that was expected from this trust was sitting at around 42 billion. Of the 42 billion income, 15 billion, it was servicing the debt cost, which leaves the trust to benefit around 27 billion as the net income that they can use for their social projects. And I think the biggest problem when you look at that chart is that even the 27 billion, it's back-ended. Because in the initial years, you have to service this, you have 5% trickle dividend, and the community was promised that the social projects that will happen, and they haven't seen that, and they are disgruntled. So that's the challenge that we're trying to address here. And then on the left, I'm trying to give an example about the investment that we've done in January 2025. We have one portfolio company currently in this fund. And that portfolio company, which is a trust in the Northern Cape, it's got 3 underlying solar PV projects. We funded around 4 million euros, which in rands is around 76 million for those 3 projects. The total capacity of those is 258 megawatts, which is 75 each of those projects. Those are our operational assets with 20 years PPA, and they reached COD, which is the commercial operation date, in March 2020. What have we achieved with funding this? One of the key things that was achieved by the community trust is that we halved the interest rate that they were paying to their previous funder. So the impact of the cost of funding being half, it was the increased endowment value of what they own. And then the second thing, we also, as part of our terms, they used to get a trickle dividend of 5%. We increased that trickle dividend to 20%. And what it means is that on a year-to-year, there's more cash now that comes to them that accelerate the implementation of those social projects that they're doing. And one of the key things really with supporting SDGs through improved community income flows. And when you think about communities, there's women inclusion, because most households are led by women in this community. And then the secondary is that we're part of an industry that is trying to mitigate climate change, and sustainability of that industry is quite important for us. And sustainability, it talks to communities being involved and not being left behind, and seeing those tangible benefits for being part of being shareholders of that. And the other benefit that is not mentioned here on these investments that we have made is that we have accelerated also some of the weaknesses when we're doing ESG due diligence, like on the things that are simple as you see the board of trustees and you find that all the people that are sitting there are not coming from the communities. There's no representation and the voice. So those are some of the things that we put in the legal agreements when we're financing this, to make those kind of changes. And we're quite pleased to be seeing some of those changes. The next slide. Okay, this is the last slide. I'll give it to Mzo to conclude on the challenges that we're facing, though we have a good product in the market.
Thanks. We encountered a number of challenges to implement this project, and some of these challenges, I must say, we didn't anticipate. The logically getting the to
Okay, Mzo seems to be breaking up. Maybe in the interest of time, let me take this. The challenge is we're getting it in three areas. From an IPP side is that there's more reliance into the into IPPs in terms of information that can be used by the funder to be able to refinance. We're finding to be a challenge because sometimes you might find that in terms of time, it's not a priority to the IPP. They will do it at their own time. And also the other challenge that we're finding is that before you start this process as a community trust, you need to get approval at the IPP level, board level. Those boards, you find most of the times they 4 times a year, quarterly, and it takes time to take that approval. So we didn't expect the timing issue will be there. And then on trustees' side, ownership and accountability sometimes is lacking. That's what we're finding in some of the trustees. And some, they do like the product, but they have fear because they do not have the technical ability to assess the risk profile, which talks to some of the things that we offer through KFW. We've been offered technical assistance that we can give to IPPs to help them in this process. Those consultants are independent of Infra Impact. They are paid by KFW and they can assist the community trust to deal with that. And also the understanding of the agency of processing the transaction sometimes is lacking when it comes to trustees. And the capacity and commitment, they're working, and some people, the commitment is a bit on the lacking side. So those are the Lando, but we have to keep on advocating on the big picture so that we can all move in the same wavelength. On community side, there's expectation gap because of the disappointments that they've seen. And we think that needs analysis is quite important, but sometimes from an IPP side, it's even difficult to do the needs analysis because when you do that, it creates expectation that you can't meet in the short term. And also the one other thing that on communities that we are it's a plea, servant leadership from people that are leading communities, because you find sometimes communities are divided and then the IPP now is stuck. It can't even, and the community trust know who to deal with, So let's try for our communities to benefit on this, to be servants and to lead with integrity. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Bulelwa. And so just moving us into the Q&A before we run out of time. I think the first one is, I'm sitting here as a participant, I'm a trustee, I'm hearing that interest rates have been halved. There's been this increase in trickle dividend, and I'm thinking, this is what my trust needs. What should we have in place as a trust before we even initiate this refinancing discussion with you, and how do we go about it?
Thank you, Masichaba. I think the first thing as a trust, when you hear this, you need to go and approach your IPP, the project company management, because they're the first one that needs to go to their board to approve, because it's quite sensitive to change any structure. It will affect the implementation agreement for the project company. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is deciding, because most trust and board of trustees, they don't have capacity to be able to do this, is deciding and asking for help from the IPP company, or you go out there and get consultants that would assist you with the transaction itself. We would complement, if you want, with the technical assistance that comes from KFW, that is independent of us as well as one of our offering. The main thing from an information perspective, it's information about the underlying project. Because for us as the funder to be paid, we rely on the dividends that come from the project company. So the risk mainly that we're assessing from a financial perspective is the underlying project. Hence, the IPP company is quite important. But secondly, which is the cost other than the interest of our funding, is governance. We can have a project company that can pay the return. If on the governance side, things are not in order, or we do not foresee a journey of correcting things and working with that trust, we will reject the deal. So to make sure that the affairs of the trust are in correct order is quite important for us. So those are the key things. Our mandate, I saw there was a question asking about it, do we go outside South Africa? Currently, our mandate is only just South Africa.
Thanks, Bulelo. Just another question. So at the moment, are you only refinancing existing trusts, or would you also consider new community equity in upcoming government programs, be it the BES project, the GES IPP project, or even the recently announced transmission development program?
Currently, we're doing refinancing only. It is our vision that we'll have a fund too, that can be part of the just energy transition, and that we can fund at financial close so that it doesn't become refinancing. Our communities, they get it from the beginning. And the reason that we went this way is that this is a product that is new. We needed to give comfort to investors. And part of the comfort for them to be able to give us the cheaper cost of funding that affords us to lend at lower interest rate is the fact that these projects are operational. So when we have a track record of having managed this and protected and gave them their return, it becomes easier to advocate for financial close where we will take construction risk. In terms of the programs like BES, we can look at it if it's a community trust that has done on BES, as long as it's renewables under RIP or BES program.
Okay. Another question. I mean, so the focus on the fund is really on this redirecting of capital and releasing, unlocking value for communities. So post the transaction, what is the nature of your involvement in the trust after that, to make sure that these funds really are being directed towards community empowerment?
Okay. As part of when we're closing the transaction, we negotiate an observer status because we don't have the real legal right to be a board of trustees. So what we do, we become like an observer in that. And that, though we don't vote, it changes the conversation. That's one. And then as part of the terms of our financing, the ESG due diligence that we do before we commit, it will show the gaps that are there in that trust. And then we will put an action plan that is part of the financing facility that lists the things that we want to be changed. If we feel like the example that I gave initially, that community is not represented in the governance structure, we will put that as a condition that we want a new trustee to be represented. And then on the projects themselves, we'll read their trust deed and the objectives and evaluate what has been done. And we'll look at the gaps on why this has not been implemented. And then it will be something that they have signed on the journey. Our ESG employees, they don't sit just here in Cape Town. They get involved in terms of making sure that those social projects are delivered in a manner that, that respects the community and that includes them. So that's our differentiator. We're not just waiting for financials and not getting involved on the delivering of social project side.
Great. And I mean, do you foresee a future where there's some consolidations of these trusts? So if you look at places like Uppington, De Aar, Priska, where you've got multiple IPPs, multiple trusts, is there a way of, and looking at it specifically from a refinancing perspective, of a restructuring into, let's say, one super trust that has multiple investments?
I don't know about that, but what has been encouraging from an IPP side is that what they've been doing when we because we've got various ways of trying to source deals, is going direct to trustees or going to IPPs. But IPPs, because they know that they're the custodians of information, what they've been doing now when we approach them and we sell this product, they will try to put together a portfolio of projects from different rounds. But most of the times, depending on the location, it will be one trust that has various projects, different rounds, and say, okay, let's look at this as a portfolio. And we find that it's encouraging, it's consolidating, and also from the cost of processing a deal, it becomes cheaper. So that's what I've seen. I don't know about trust to trust consolidation, which in my view, it could be challenging. Trusts are challenging on its own. I don't know if you bring different characters, it will add value.
Thank you so much. We've got such limited time available and so many other interesting questions. I wondered actually if even if Mark would want to step in and talk about this question always around whether how stokvels could be mobilized as a viable investment vehicle or as a collective to support this, either the funding of community ownership or the refinancing even as an alternative source of capital.
Yeah, I think as Bilal alluded earlier, look, it's a massive, how can I say, amount of capital required in this space, and I think there's definitely opportunities for different sources of funding to come to the aid and provide solutions. And I don't think anybody's precluded from participating in finding solutions for the problem. And yeah, we'd be supportive of initiatives of that nature. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you so much to our panelists for a very interesting discussion. I think as a closing round for all speakers, I think just very briefly on what you think, why you think we should accelerate the unlocking of financial capacity for community trusts, or how should we be thinking about this accelerating of that financial capacity of community trusts? We can start on my side. I'm seeing Bulelwa first.
For me, my thinking and my passion about this is passion for me. And I keep it simple because now we're closing coal plants in Mpumalanga. And people used to benefit on the value chain of that. So when we're doing that, how do we make sure that those communities that used to benefit from the coal industry, to make sure they benefit on the new world of protecting our environment for the future of our kids? So to me, it's a challenge that I'm posing to the pension fund industry. It's a challenge that I'm posing to the fund managers. It's a challenge that I'm posing to the corporates, where I'm saying, I'm challenging even the donors, where I'm saying, let's come together with the different risk profiles and try to bring products that are solving the issues so that we have a sustainable industry that delivers to everyone. So really, I'll walk that journey, I'll knock doors to be able to achieve this in our lifetime.
Thank you very much. I see Thuli.
Thank you so much, Ms. Chaba. I think the issues have really been highlighted very well by Bulelwa. For me, it's also just taking attention away from focusing on community trusts as we know them, but also becoming creative around what else they can look like so that meaningful ownership actually occurs. And also, it's encouraging to see organizations like Bulelwa's organization that are providing different packages to actually solve the problem around financing. We need more of that, as Bulelwa has indicated, not just from her company, but also from the pension funds and other funds that can put their heads together and say, how do we actually solve this, so that we take focus away from the community trust really struggling about financing and how to get going, and any innovative structures that can come to place, so that the focus is not about how do we actually access funding to take off, but around the actual delivery of development in communities. Thank you.
Thank you. Yumna?
Thank you so much. I think so the first one is, I think that if community trusts do only one thing, if they focus on only one thing, I think we'd see a market improvement. And that is capacitating and empowering and opening up the opportunities for community members to really get engaged in decision-making and in co-creating development programs for their future. I think if we only get that right, we'll build a very strong foundation for a lot of community-enabled development to happen in future. That's the one thing. I think the other thing is to get more community trusts investing in the long term. So not only in long-term socioeconomic projects, but investing in financial projects to be able to get returns beyond year 20. Because after year 20, dividends stop, and we ideally want this momentum that we've started to continue. And then an idea that came out to that point at our learning event in February by one of our panelists was to ask community trust to take a small percentage of what they have and invest collectively, as all of the community trusts in the country, or as many as possible, to invest in 100% community-owned IPP. And I think that could really be amazingly powerful as a macro meta opportunity for community trust as a concept.
Thank you so much. Mzo?
Thanks, Mashaba. And apologies earlier, I lost my network at exactly the wrong moment. I think for me, it's the people who serve as trustees in these local community trusts. If they could take their role more seriously and understand the power that they do have. It's in one of the sessions I attended that was run by Inspire, I was amazed at hearing community trustees complaining that they are being controlled by the trust manager, when in fact, technically the trust manager is appointed by them. So I think for me, it's just having those sessions where the community trust can be made to understand their role and understand the powers that they do have, and the opportunities that are there that they could explore for their communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And best for last, Mark.
Thanks, Mr. Chaba, and thanks, panelists. I think, in a nutshell, what we're dealing with here is trying to make the most of an enabling environment that has been set up by our government to address social and economic issues of the past using a program to uplift rural communities. And what we're trying to do is trying to reduce the exploitation of those communities by exorbitant interest rates and just other factors that is taking away so much that is needed in those communities. And I think this collaboration and this partnership with Inspire and all the other stakeholders on this call here today is evident that, you know, as South Africans, we can overcome very difficult challenges when we work together. And I'm very interested and excited to see what the future is for us in supporting this program. And thank you for hosting us.
Thank you so much, Mark, and thank you to all the panelists. I think, you know, when I think about the potential of trusts, I think of a comment that Mike has made around the lack of service delivery by the public sectors in our communities and the role that trusts are actually playing at the moment in filling that gap. And that really speaks to why all of us need to collectively find these solutions to bridge the gap between the vision of trust as these vehicles of community empowerment and the reality that we're seeing in the ground. And we need these structures, we need these trusts to be robust, inclusive, and capable of delivering real benefits. And there's an actual ecosystem of support that's needed, and financing is but one of them. And so we're very glad to have this partnership, and we encourage everyone to stay in touch with us. All of the presentations are going to be shared, and you'll also get this recording. And I'm hoping that part of the slides we'll share will actually include the contact details for the Infra Impact team. I think we know what the request is from Bulelwa. Reflect as trusts, reflect as trustees. Go to your IPP, get your house in order, and together let's unlock value for our communities. Thank you, everyone, and have a very good afternoon further.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.